They used to say that 3 pilots in a cockpit was a fortress, something impossible to break. That was the thinking in aviation anyway, until a Turkish Airlines flight fell from the sky into a field near Amsterdam. At the controls was a legend, Captain Hasan Arisan, but even his experience was powerless against an invisible betrayal. At the most critical moment, the plane itself decided the flight was over, and silently cut power to the engines, right in mid-air. Why didn't the crew notice the dead silence from the turbines? And how did blind faith in smart electronics lead to the deaths of everyone on board, just a mile from safety? The February sky over Amsterdam is covered by a thick gray blanket, but inside the cockpit of the Turkish Airlines Boeing 737, the atmosphere is perfectly calm. At the controls is Murat Cesar, a pilot undergoing retraining, and for him, this flight is the final exam. Every move he makes is precise, down to the millimeter, because over his right shoulder, in the instructor's seat, sits a true aviation legend. Hasan Arisan is a man with thousands of flight hours under his belt, a former military pilot whose cool-headedness has long been the gold standard for his colleagues. Squeezed into this tight space as a third is Olgay Ozgur, an experienced pilot acting as an extra set of eyes. In aviation, they call this lineup a fortress. While the trainee flies the aircraft under the watchful eye of the instructor, the third pilot's job is to monitor the instruments, communications, and the horizon. It's a triple-check system, where any mistake should be caught and corrected long before it becomes dangerous. Instructor Hasan offers short, clipped corrections to the trainee's actions, creating an illusion of complete safety. It seems like there's simply no weak link in this chain of 3 professionals. However, an invisible tension is building in the cockpit. Too many people in such a small space is turning a clear hierarchy into a trap. When 3 people are watching the instruments, the lines of responsibility begin to blur. Subconsciously, each one is relying on the next, believing that if they miss something, the seasoned instructor or the attentive observer will surely sound the alarm. This quiet confidence in the infallibility of the system is lulling the crew's vigilance, just as the plane's automated systems begin to play their own hidden game. The iron bird carrying them through the clouds isn't just any plane, it's a symbol of reliability in modern global aviation. The Boeing 737-800 is rightfully known as the workhorse of the skies, and this particular aircraft, named Tekirdağ, is in its technical prime. It's only 7 years old, that perfect age when all the systems have been proven by time, but are still far from showing any signs of fatigue or wear. The morning departure from sunny Istanbul is so smooth, it feels like absolute routine for the entire crew. The jetliner confidently climbs to flight level 360, calmly piercing the European sky at an altitude of 11 kilometers. Inside the cabin, a lazy, peaceful atmosphere signals the end of the flight. Passengers are finishing their cold coffee, flipping through glossy magazines, or dozing off, completely unaware that their fate has already been secretly sealed by an invisible glitch in the airliner's complex electronic brain. While the people below enjoy the comfort of the flight, deep within the plane's systems, a tiny, yet utterly fatal malfunction is hiding, like a silent ticking time bomb. The left radio altimeter, the plane's electronic eyes looking down, is behaving suspiciously and covertly. Usually, this kind of technical problem reveals itself instantly, lighting up bright warning lamps on the instrument panel. But today, the cunning system is playing a game of cat and mouse. It remains treacherously silent at high altitude, where its data isn't critical to the autopilot's operation. This electronic traitor is patiently waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The glitch will only fully activate when the ground is terrifyingly close, leaving the crew with mere seconds to realize what is happening. The pilots calmly continue their professional conversation, preparing for a routine descent, putting all their trust in the smart machine that is already poised to brutally deceive them. Imagine your own brain was split into 2 halves that fundamentally refuse to talk to each other. That's exactly how the strange and dangerous electronic mind of this modern Boeing is designed, and this architectural feature is about to become a death sentence. The flight control system isn't one single all-knowing brain. It's actually two completely separate computers, working in total isolation. Channel A always serves the captain, and fanatically trusts only his left side sensors. Channel B works for the first officer, and sees the world exclusively through the right side instruments. They're like two proud, stubborn neighbors living on opposite sides of the same wall, who never bother to check their watches with one another. The moment the pilots engage the left autopilot for the landing approach, the massive airliner instantly becomes a hostage to a single point of view. And here lies the terrifying vulnerability. If the left radio altimeter suddenly decides to lie and say the ground is already under the wheels, the main computer won't even think to ask the healthy right side sensor, "Hey, what are you seeing?" It will simply accept the blatant lie as gospel and begin to act on it. This is the critical moment where blind machine logic enters into a deadly conflict with reality. The crew, trained for years to trust smart electronics, falls into a classic psychological safety trap. The pilots genuinely believe that modern triple redundancy systems will protect them from any random failure. But they forget that a computer is just an executor, devoid of the human ability to doubt. Right now, one of the autopilot's eyes is going blind, but the machine continues to confidently lead the crew, relying on a fatal illusion. A single invisible beam becomes the main, and most treacherous, betrayer in this story. The radio altimeter works like sonar, or a bat's echolocation. The device sends a pulse straight down, catches the reflection from the surface, and with surgical precision, tells the computer exactly how many meters separate the landing gear from the concrete. But today, the left sensor, located on Captain Hassan's side, decides to go insane. Even during the climb, the numbers on its display began to dance erratically, before freezing on a completely absurd, impossible reading: -8 feet. It's a frighteningly surreal situation. The airliner is slicing through the clouds at cruising altitude, but its left electronic hemisphere is convinced that the plane isn't just on the ground, but is somehow taxiing along it, having sunk slightly beneath the tarmac. This is the first major break where reality diverges from a digital hallucination. The machine is receiving false inputs that contradict every law of physics, but it continues to silently store this error in its memory. The tragedy is that the crew can clearly see these strange readings. However, the pilots fall for a classic attention-grabbing trick: a red herring. At cruising altitude, data on the height above the ground is completely useless, like parking sensors on a highway. To them, this glitch is just a minor, annoying distraction, informational noise that can simply be ignored. They confidently continue the flight, never suspecting that this harmless -8 feet isn't just a display error, but a cocked trigger. By ignoring the broken sensor, they are allowing the flight control system to hold onto a fatal command, one that will execute the very second it's far too late to fix anything. This failure isn't some random ghost in the machine. It's an infamous star in the endless technical reports at the Boeing Corporation. For years, engineers' desks were flooded with thousands of complaints about radio altimeters that behaved erratically, switching on and off for no apparent reason. Technicians all over the world looked for the root of the problem in basic physics. They blamed moisture, corroded contacts, or poor insulation on the antennas under the fuselage. Mechanics dutifully replaced gaskets and resealed connectors, but the problem stubbornly returned, like an incurable chronic illness. Over time, everyone simply got used to these constant technical moods, downgrading them from critically dangerous to annoying little quirk. This terrifying phenomenon is called the normalization of deviance, the moment a recurring failure stops being scary and becomes an acceptable part of the daily routine. In response to this epidemic of failures, Boeing did issue a strict directive with the complex name DDPG. This document stated a fatal warning in black and white. With a faulty radio altimeter, the use of the autothrottle is strictly forbidden. It seemed like a safeguard was in place, but here lies the devilish detail of aviation bureaucracy. This instruction was intended exclusively for engineers on the ground, before takeoff. As soon as the airliner lifted off the runway, that document became essentially worthless. In the air, pilots live by a completely different Bible, the QRH, or Quick Reference Handbook. And here's the paradox. In the emergency checklist that the crew is required to use in flight, there isn't a single word about this deadly prohibition. The pilots are flying straight into a trap, with no idea that their primary flight manual is treacherously silent about a life-threatening danger. Theoretically, the paperwork and instructions are all down on the ground. But up here, in the skies over the Netherlands, the crew is facing the harsh reality of the February weather. Amsterdam greets the Boeing not with the welcoming lights of the city, but with a thick, viscous grayness that wraps itself around the fuselage. Schiphol is socked in by low clouds, and visibility is dropping by the minute, turning the final leg of the flight into a tense, blind approach. A solid wall of cloud rages beyond the thick cockpit glass, a churning milk where the sky and the ground have completely merged. But inside, in the warm, well-lit space, a dangerous illusion of total control and sterile calm remains. The trainee, Murat Cesar, is conducting the standard pre-landing briefing, methodically reciting each future action, like a diligent student in an exam. His voice is firm, confident. And why wouldn't it be? He's got two experienced instructors sitting right beside him, just an arm's reach away, ready to step in. For now, the massive aircraft is responding obediently to every touch of the controls. The crew calmly settles in for a classic ILS approach, a procedure they've practiced hundreds of times. Think of it as a set of invisible electronic rails, designed to guide the plane smoothly, automatically, and safely through the fog, straight to the threshold of runway 18 right. It seems like this flight is about to end in boring professional routine. But then, a calm, business-like voice from the controller crackles in their headsets, and suddenly, the rules of the game have changed. The ground unexpectedly shatters their measured, calm plan, issuing a directive for a non-standard approach. Instead of the usual long, gentle descent, the controllers decide to cut a corner, vectoring the jet onto a shorter, more aggressive final approach. This fateful decision instantly compresses the precious time the pilots have to run their checklists and forces the crew to ramp up their pace. They don't yet know that this forced rush, this break in their normal rhythm, is about to become the perfect catalyst for a technical disaster, lying dormant deep within the autopilot. Instead of focused silence, the cockpit is suddenly torn apart by the hysterical wail of a siren, a sound that makes your heart skip a beat. A bright red light flashes in their eyes, and a mechanical voice insists, "Gear down!" To the crew, this sharp sound in their headsets is like the ravings of a madman. They're still miles from the runway, with 2,000 feet of damp Dutch emptiness below the wings. Putting the gear down now would violate every rule in the book. But for some reason, the smart electronics are utterly convinced the plane is already rolling down the concrete. It's the left radio altimeter, that sleeping agent, waking up again. It sees the ground directly beneath the fuselage, sending a fatally false signal to the main computer. Captain Hassan Arisan reacts to this acoustic chaos instantly, not with fear, but with a cold, professional irritation. For a veteran with thousands of flight hours, this isn't an omen of disaster, but just another technical quirk, a known chronic issue with these Boeings that pilots whisper about in the break rooms. With a decisive move, he silences the nagging alarm, restoring an illusory, working quiet to the cockpit. The crew collectively exhales, treating the incident as a minor technical glitch, completely unworthy of their attention during the tense approach. But in that very second, the flight's main psychological trap snaps shut. The false alarm effect works like a perfect anesthetic on their vigilance. The pilots firmly convince themselves the system is just mistaken, never suspecting that this wail was the machine's last, desperate warning before it would begin to kill them for real. The irritating whine of the false alarm has barely faded when the controller drops a new, far more complex task on the crew, completely breaking their rhythm. The command comes for a short approach, a maneuver that, for a heavy airliner, is like trying to park a race car at full speed. Normally, pilots have a comfortable 10 miles to smoothly bleed off energy and prepare the aircraft for landing, as if following a musical score. But now, They're being turned onto the final approach just 6 miles from the runway. Space and time have been cut in half. The plane is too high and flying too fast for this distance, turning it into a heavy, inert projectile that resists descending. The cockpit instantly switches to a high-pressure, time crunch mode, where every second is a scarce commodity. The race for the glide slope begins, a desperate attempt to squeeze the huge Boeing into the narrow descent corridor. The mental load on the crew skyrockets to a critical level. They have to bleed off inertia, extend the flaps, read checklists, and capture the localizer beam all at once. Their focus narrows to the size of a keyhole, fixated solely on trying to get back on the flight profile. In the chaos, with all 3 pilots consumed by the fight to lose altitude, their overloaded brains simply filter out everything secondary. They are so engrossed in their procedures that they physically fail to notice the ultimate betrayal. The thrust levers, obeying the computer's flawed command, quietly and smoothly slide all the way back, completely cutting power from the turbines. In the escalating chaos, the trainee, Murat Cesar, makes a fatal error. He reaches for the overhead panel to engage the second autopilot, a critical step for creating what's known as a dual-channel system. This redundant system is essential for landing the aircraft perfectly straight in the milky fog, entrusting the controls to 2 computers at once. But the rush of the short approach plays a cruel trick on his motor skills. Murat's usually steady fingers fumble the sequence. He messes up the strict order of button presses, and, instead of adding reliability, he accidentally disengages the primary autopilot. For a few, infinitely long seconds, the 70-ton airliner, full of passengers, hangs in the gray sky, completely uncontrolled, stripped of its digital mind. Murat reacts instantly, but it's the reflex of a startled student during an exam, not a cool-headed pilot. He frantically re-engages the system, silently hoping that the stern instructor to his left was too busy with radio communications to notice the slip-up. The iron brain takes control again, but an invisible, yet terrifying breakdown has occurred in the cockpit. This is a classic example of hierarchy suppressing safety. Instead of shouting "autopilot off," as procedure demands, Murat chooses silence. He's afraid to admit his incompetence in front of the legendary Captain Arisan. This hidden mistake shatters the crew's shared situational awareness. The trainee is now mentally overloaded, spending precious brain power on suppressing his panic and hiding the evidence, while the captain remains blissfully unaware, assuming his co-pilot has everything under control. The Boeing is hurtling toward the runway like a heavy locomotive that the driver is desperately trying to stop on a critically short stretch of track. A treacherous tailwind and the shortcut from the controller have forced the crew into a tight aerodynamic trap. The airliner is dangerously high above the glide slope, that invisible safe path to the ground. They've overshot the ideal entry point, and now, to even make it to the runway, they have to break the rules of smooth piloting. Captain Hasan Arisan, seeing that the cautious trainee isn't managing the descent profile, begins to aggressively intervene. He doesn't take the controls himself, but instead attacks the autopilot panel. His fingers frantically spin the vertical speed knob, forcing the plane's nose down, trying to make the multi-ton machine literally dive to catch up with the receding radio beam. The cockpit instantly descends into an organizational chaos that completely destroys their teamwork. The attention of 3 professionals shatters into useless fragments. The trainee, Murat, gripping the yoke, tries to hold their course in the turbulence. The captain is lost in the numbers, trying to outsmart the geometry of the approach. And the third pilot, Olgay, their best hope and living backup, turns away from the instrument panel at that exact moment to answer a completely routine call from a flight attendant on the interphone. A deadly tunnel vision sets in. All 3 are obsessed with a single goal: to capture the glide slope at any cost. In this mad race for altitude, they are missing the very essence of flight. While all eyes are glued to the altimeter, not one of them notices that the speed tape, the aircraft's very pulse, has already begun its irreversible slide into the red zone of disaster. At the very moment the navigation system finally locks onto the localizer beam, a frightening, yet completely silent change occurs on the captain's main display. The magenta crosshairs of the flight director bars, those magic wands that show the pilot exactly where to point the nose for a perfect approach, instantly vanish. The screen in front of Hassan Arasan goes blank. This isn't just a graphical glitch, it's the logical conclusion of the chain of errors. The computer, believing the false signal that it has touched down, has switched to its ground roll phase, right in the middle of the clouds. For the smart machine, the flight is technically over, so it removes the in-air guidance cues that are useless on a concrete runway. For a professional pilot, losing the flight director during a blind approach is like a tightrope walker suddenly going blind. It's a top priority alarm that should interrupt all other actions. But a sinister, inattentional blindness reigns in the cockpit. The captain is so absorbed in manually tweaking the descent parameters that his unfocused gaze simply slides past the blank indicator. The third pilot, whose job is to be an independent observer, is still turned toward the door, dealing with routine matters with the cabin crew. And the trainee, seeing how agitated his instructor is afraid to speak up. A state of total information blackout occurs. The aircraft is honestly telling the humans that it's ceasing navigation support, but the crew, hypnotized by routine and haste, ignores this final silent warning before the crash. While the crew's attention is scattered, the autothrottle performs an act that becomes an irreversible death sentence for the flight. The electronic brain, having received the insane reading of -8 feet from the left sensor, draws the only logical conclusion for a robot. We've arrived. In its distorted digital reality, the landing gear is already rolling on the concrete, even though outside the window there are 500 meters of raw, gray abyss. The system instantly activates flare mode, the final landing phase, and issues the fatal retard command. Right under the pilot's elbows, a chilling, almost mystical movement occurs. The thrust levers come alive. Smoothly, confidently, and in complete silence, they move on their own, sliding all the way back to the stop, into the idle position. The powerful roar of the turbines fades to a quiet whisper as they spool down to idle. But in the busy cockpit, that subtle shift is treacherously lost, swallowed by the rush of air outside. The engines, the very heart of the aircraft, obediently fall silent, their battle against gravity over. In that instant, the Boeing effectively dies as an airplane. It becomes a giant, 70-ton glider. The golden rule of aviation is simple. On final approach, you keep your hand on the throttles. Had the captain's hand been where it was supposed to be, he would have physically felt the technology betraying him. But his hands are busy with the autopilot controls, while the trainee pilot has the yoke in a death grip. The airliner is now hanging in the air on a prayer and the last of its momentum. An invisible countdown begins. For exactly 100 seconds, the engines will remain in a deep, lethargic sleep. 100 long seconds, during which their kinetic energy bleeds away, all while the crew stares at the attitude indicator, completely unaware that their flight has already become a fall. So why don't these experienced pilots feel the life draining from their aircraft? It all comes down to the insidious nature of the automation. In these crucial moments, it acts like a perfect anesthesiologist, masking the symptoms of the unfolding disaster. The autopilot, now starved of engine power, is doing everything it can to complete its assigned task: keep the airliner on the glide slope. To do that, it has only one tool left: the elevators. The electronic brain begins to smoothly, degree by degree, pitch the nose of the aircraft up. It's making a fatal trade-off, sacrificing precious airspeed to maintain the correct altitude, and this very maneuver creates a terrifying illusion of perfect stability in the cockpit. The pilot's eyes are glued to the navigation display, where the purple diamond of the glide slope sits perfectly centered. This flawless picture is deceiving their inner ears and their professional intuition. To them, the descent feels completely normal, because the aircraft is obediently holding its course. But this obedience is just the mask of a machine in its death throes. With every passing second, the wing's angle of attack increases, the air resistance grows, and the momentum vanishes. The airliner is like a car coasting in neutral up a steep hill. It's still moving forward, but its energy is rapidly running out. You can't cheat the physics of flight with a pretty picture on a screen. The speed drops to a critical level, and the enormous machine teeters on the fine edge of a stall, held aloft only by an ever steeper pitch angle. In aviation, there's an invisible but absolute line that separates safe flight from a deadly gamble. The airliner crosses a critical threshold, 1,000 feet. This is the gate in the sky, the point where the crew must pass their final exam before landing. Here, the unforgiving rules of a stabilized approach take effect. The aircraft must be fully configured, all checklists complete, and the speed locked precisely on the calculated target. If even one of these parameters is off, the pilot has only one correct, lawful option: immediately apply full power and execute a go-around. This isn't a suggestion, it's an imperative, written in the wreckage of other aircraft. But aboard the Tekkerdag, this vital exam is being spectacularly failed. Instead of precise procedure, there's dangerous improvisation and a sense of being rushed. They are catastrophically behind schedule. The landing checklist has been abandoned halfway through, and their flight parameters are far from stable. The situation is screaming for them to break off this flawed approach. But common sense shatters against the silent, impenetrable wall of the cockpit hierarchy. A heavy, suffocating silence hangs in the air. The timid trainee, Murat, is physically incapable of questioning the inaction of his legendary instructor, while the monitoring third pilot is paralyzed by the captain's immense authority. This social hierarchy is exerting more pressure on them than any G-force could. Not one of the three can find the courage to shout the simple, life-saving command, "Go around." Instead of a life-saving climb back into the sky, they meekly continue their descent, willingly leading themselves and their passengers into the final stage of the trap. Instead of focused silence, the cockpit is once again pierced by a bright flash of amber light. At exactly 500 feet, the point of no return, the master caution light illuminates. The display flashes a spoiler configuration error. It's a classic red herring, a false alarm thrown up by the aircraft's confused electronics. The system is just acting up, but for the overloaded crew, this signal becomes a fatal distraction. Instead of watching the airspeed tape or searching for the runway through the breaks in the clouds, the pilots lower their heads. They begin reading a checklist, trying to solve a technical puzzle that, at this moment, has absolutely no bearing on their survival. And as they focus on this phantom problem, the reality outside the cockpit is becoming catastrophic. The engines are still silent at idle, and their airspeed, the very breath in the aircraft's lungs, is bleeding away completely, dropping below 100 knots. 40 tons of metal are no longer flying. They are simply hanging in the damp fog, suspended by the last vestiges of their momentum. The autopilot, desperately trying to hold altitude without thrust, keeps pitching the nose higher and higher, pushing the angle to a critical 10 degrees. The airliner now resembles a person leaning too far back, losing their balance at the very edge of a cliff. The airflow breaks away from the smooth surface of the wings, churning into useless, turbulent vortices. The physics of controlled flight no longer apply, replaced by the brutal laws of freefall. But the crew is still mesmerized by the error message on the screen, completely oblivious as their aircraft hangs motionless, just before its final, deadly plunge. Suddenly, the tense silence of the cockpit is shattered by a violent rattling, like a jackhammer being held right in the pilot's hands. It's the stick shaker, the aircraft's last, most frantic line of defense against a stall. The control columns begin to vibrate wildly, a physical jolt designed to violently shake the pilots from their lethal trance. The aircraft is literally screaming at them in the language of mechanical vibration, "We are stalling!" And only in that moment does the fog lift from their eyes. The third pilot, Olgay Ozgur, finally glances at the airspeed tape and freezes in horror, realizing the full scope of the disaster. His desperate shout, "Airspeed! Airspeed!" cuts through the noise of the shaker. The trainee, Murat, acting on pure adrenaline, makes the correct, instinctive move. He shoves the thrust levers forward with all his might, trying to breathe life back into the suffocating turbines. The engine RPMs begin to climb. The nose of the aircraft lowers. For a moment, it seems like there's a chance. But this is where the most tragic conflict between man and machine plays out. Murat, trying to save the plane in a panic, forgets to press the two small autothrottle disconnect buttons on the thrust levers themselves. It's a death sentence. The moment his hand loosens its grip for just a split second to grab the yoke, the rogue computer snatches control back. The electronic brain, still convinced the aircraft has already landed, decisively and forcefully pulls the power back to idle. The levers are literally ripped from his grasp, sliding back to their idle position on their own. The Boeing is fighting its own rescue. The pilots are trying to give it power, and the blind automation is stubbornly choking the engines. "I have control!" The sharp cry from the captain, Hasan Arisan, cuts through the mechanical chaos and the wail of the siren. He sees the trainee is losing the fight against the haywire machine and instinctively takes over, wrenching the yoke from Murat's frozen hands. In any other situation, this would be the moment of salvation, the seasoned veteran taking charge, restoring order. But now, with time running out, this change of command is a fatal hesitation. There's a fatal loss of rhythm. As one pilot releases the controls and the other tries to get a feel for the dying aircraft, precious moments are slipping away, never to be recovered. Arisan finally does what should have been done 8 seconds earlier. He slams the thrust levers all the way forward, demanding immediate maximum power from the engines. But you can't override the laws of physics, not even with a captain's command. Turbofan engines aren't like light bulbs that switch on instantly. They are massive, high-inertia machines, weighing tons. They need physical time to ingest air, inject fuel, and spin their heavy titanium fan blades up to takeoff speed. Engineers call this spool-up time. But pilots know the terrifying truth. It takes about 4 seconds for the turbines to go from idle to full, life-saving thrust. 4 seconds. It's nothing in normal life, the time it takes for a single deep breath. But here, with the wet Dutch soil rushing up to meet them, it's an eternity they simply don't have. The radio altimeter, the culprit in this drama, now reveals a terrible truth. There are only 150 meters of empty space under the airliner's belly. The plane is sinking into this air pocket tail first, and while the engines are just beginning to whine as they spool up, gravity has already delivered its final, merciless verdict. The turbines finally roar to life, filling the air with their powerful thunder, but the physics of flight have already passed their point of no return. Gravity has won. The cockpit fills with the last, most terrifying sound a pilot can ever hear, the hysterical mechanical shriek of the GPWS. Pull up! But there is no more air beneath the wings. The massive machine, having lost all its lift, is falling from the sky like a stone, plummeting flat towards the ground. The tail section of the Boeing is the first to hit the soft, damp soil of a farmer's field. The monstrous impact instantly kills its forward momentum, acting as a brutal, deadly brake. The airliner's structure simply cannot withstand such a force. The fuselage, with a horrifying shriek of tearing metal, snaps in 2 places, breaking apart into 3 separate pieces, just like a plastic toy. The heavy engines, still spinning, are torn from their pylons and flung aside. It's all over in a matter of moments. And then, an eerie, ringing silence hangs over the mangled field, a silence more terrifying than any scream. There's no fireball, no explosion. Just steam rising from hot metal and the sharp, acrid smell of jet fuel. It's the cruelest twist of fate. They came down just a mile short of the Polderbahn runway. The airport was so close, its lights were visible through the fog. But that final mile had become an impassable chasm. The final toll is grim. The crash claims the lives of 9 people. Among the dead is the entire flight crew. Hasan, Murat, and Olgay died at their posts, fighting until the very last split second to pull the aircraft back into the sky and break the fatal chain of events. As the wreckage cools in the Dutch mud, the decoded black boxes begin to tell their impartial story, revealing a perfect, yet lethal, chain of coincidences. Investigators piece together this tragic puzzle, and a fatal triangle begins to emerge. A faulty radio altimeter, an overeager autothrottle, and 3 pairs of eyes looking everywhere except at their plummeting airspeed. In the boardrooms, a war of blame erupts. Boeing representatives point the finger squarely at the pilot's seats. It's a pilot's core duty to constantly monitor the flight parameters. The corporation's argument is simple. If the captain had just kept his hand on the thrust levers, he would have physically felt them move back to idle. But experts in the airline fire back furiously. Should a soulless machine have the authority to silently kill the engines during a landing based on a single faulty sensor? This ignites a fundamental debate about the philosophy of safety. Should an aircraft be smart enough to make decisions that could kill its own crew? The final report reads like a damning diagnosis for all of modern aviation. The problem, it turned out, wasn't with the hardware, but in the mind. Pilots had become hostages to automation dependency. They had grown so used to trusting their electronic assistants that their manual flying skills had started to atrophy. The crew had become passive observers in their own cockpit, waiting for the smart computer to solve the problem for them. Ultimately, the root cause of the crash wasn't a technical failure, but human psychology. That dangerous assumption that the technology will never get it wrong. 9 lives became the terrible price aviation paid for a critical software update. Flight 1951 was no longer just a tragedy. It became a sobering lesson for the entire global industry. The disaster fundamentally rewrote the rules of engagement between human and machine. Pilot training went through a revolution. Before, crews learned to recover from a stall high in the sky, where there was plenty of room for error. Now, simulators force them to react when the ground is rushing up to meet them. Boeing also changed the digital DNA of its airliners. Never again would a single sensor be given the absolute authority to silently kill the engines. The autopilot's logic was reprogrammed to listen to both eyes, instead of blindly trusting a single liar. But for Hassan, Murat, and Olgay, these updates came too late. 3 professionals died because of a cruel irony. Their smart plane decided the flight was over while it was still in the air, and the humans simply ran out of time to argue. They were fighting a ghost in the machine. This story leaves us with a chilling realization about our modern world. The greatest danger in the skies today isn't a flaming engine or a broken wing. It's that quiet, comfortable moment when a human stops watching the instruments, putting blind faith in the idea that the computer knows best. Sometimes the machine is wrong. And when it is, the price of blind trust is measured in human lives.